Okay, so you guys might be asking, well, why spend so much time on this concept of validity? Why is this concept useful? Why should we learn it? Look, one reason that it's good to learn it is that, it will save you some work, right? You look at an argument, at least a deductive argument, and if it turns out that it's not valid, then you might not need to go any further, right? If it's not valid, it doesn't matter how good the premises might be. It doesn't matter if they are as true, as free from doubt, as clear as you want them to be. The argument is not a convincing argument. So, looking at arguments and seeing whether they're valid is a way to save yourself some work, right? Because it's often pretty hard to evaluate the premises. But, if you just look at it and see it's not valid, you can save yourself that work. But why else is validity useful? Well, look, I'm not going to get into this. If you take other logic classes, validity itself, you can get almost mathematical procedures for seeing whether an argument's valid or not. We would do that if you took a logic class, right? Now, what is useful here, though, is that you can learn to recognize some valid forms of argument and some invalid forms of argument or fallacies, right? And if you see that an argument uses this valid form, well, then you know the argument is valid. If you see the argument uses a fallacy or has a fallacious form, then you know it's invalid, right? So, in a sense, once you learn these valid forms of argument, you don't even need to make the effort of, well, trying to imagine a way the argument could be false. You can just see, well, it's valid or not. Okay, so the only valid forms of argument and the only fallacies I'm going to really talk about are conditionals. Your reading talks about disjunctions, that's a fancy term for either or statements. It talks about conjunctions. That's a fancy term for and statements. I'm not going to talk about those. If you guys are interested, go look at the reading. I'm not going to talk about them because people don't tend to make mistakes with arguments that use either or statements or and statements, right? They're important, especially so-called argument by elimination, either this or that, not that, so this, right? That'll come up sometimes. Those are pretty simple, though. People don't mess them up. You don't need me, you don't need a philosophy class to do well with those kinds of arguments. What people do tend to mess up, and often quite badly, are arguments involving conditionals. And conditionals will be important for many of the arguments we will make in this class. So I'm going to spend some time on conditionals because I think that they're really important. They're also a bit tricky. So conditional is just a fancy way of saying if ... then ... right? The if-then statements. Here's an example of a conditional. If you work hard, you will pass the class. It's a true conditional, by the way. So, remember that. Your reading has some examples of other conditionals. I think he has this one. If Maria walks to work, she'll be late. Another conditional. Conditional, just if blank, then blank, right? If A, then B. That is a conditional statement. Now look, it's important to notice the conditional statement doesn't get as much of anything in and of itself, right? If you work hard, you will pass. Well, you don't necessarily know anything from that statement because we have to know whether you're going to work hard or not, right? If Maria walks to work, she'll be late. Well, even if that's true, doesn't tell us much because we don't know whether she's going to walk to work or not. All right. Anyway, there are two valid forms of argument with a conditional. These valid forms will allow us to go from the fact that you have a conditional and another true statement to a third statement, right? They will be a valid argument once you have your conditional and one other thing. You can reach your conclusion. You know the conclusion couldn't be false. The two valid forms of argument with a conditional are modus ponens and modus tollens. I apologize for using the Latin jargon. I have no idea what it means. It's just the terms that have come down to us. This is not going to be on a quiz or anything. You don't need to know the jargon. You'll just need to know if you see an argument that uses modus ponens or modus tollens, it's a valid argument. It's kind of sad. I don't know what these mean. I actually did take Latin in high school for an entire year. My Latin teacher, though, was in the midst of a midlife crisis. He was not a great Latin teacher. I liked the guy, but he did not do a lot to teach us Latin. I learned a lot about why he thought his first marriage failed, not so much about Latin, though. Anyway. There are also, and don't worry, I'm going to give you guys some examples of modus tollens and modus ponens. We'll go into a lot more detail with these. Just want to get the valid forms and the fallacious forms on the table first. There are two fallacious arguments with conditionals. Fallacious meaning it's an invalid form of argument, but it's tricky. It looks valid. A lot of people take it to be valid. And the two fallacious arguments with conditionals are affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. I'll give you guys examples of these, and I'll explain a bit more why they're fallacious. Be on the lookout for them, though. So first, let's talk about modus ponens. Your reading mentions it. I'll give you guys another example, though, right? Just in a very outline form, modus ponens says you have your conditional, if A, then B. Well, if you have A, you also have B, right? If you have a conditional that says if A, then B, then whenever you know that you have A, you also get B, right? That's really abstract, but let's fill it in. If you work hard in class, you will pass. Bill has worked hard in class, therefore Bill will pass, right? If the conditional's true, the conditional says if you work hard, you'll pass. If Bill's worked hard, he'll pass, right? If A, then B, A, so B. If you work hard, you will pass. Bill worked hard, so Bill will pass. Another example of an argument using a conditional, using modus ponens. If you think everyone is out to get you and that you're smarter than everyone else, then you're a jerk. John thinks everyone is out to get him and he's smarter than they are. John is a jerk. Right? If, A, then B, A, so B, right? It's interesting. I'm actually thinking of this one philosopher, not that he is a jerk, but this guy, Eric Schwitzgebel, has actually tongue a little bit in cheek, but semi-seriously written a lot about jerks, right? This is one of the set of criteria he forgives for being a jerk. You think you're smarter than everybody else, and you think everyone's out to get you, you're a jerk, right? He gives some other ones. If you guys are interested, Google Schwitzgebel and jerks. He's written some pretty interesting, also generally kind of funny stuff. A lot of times he'll say, if you recognize yourself in this description, it's worrying, you might be a jerk. Watch out for that, right? So anyway, just another example. I shouldn't admit this. I'm actually thinking of a student I had several years ago when I wrote this. His name's not John. Decided it was probably bad for him to use his actual name, but all right. Anyway, You should not be the guy in the room who derisively explains to other people why they're stupid. That's not an endearing trait, right? Moving right along. Also, if you are the guy in the room who explains to other people why they're stupid, you know, they might have reasons for not liking you besides they're out to get you, right? Just, you know, just a thought. Anyway, moving back to, you know, the stuff about conditionals. There are a few points to remember here. You know, remember modus ponens is valid. Some other things to remember. A lot of times when people use conditionals, they won't explicitly write it in this if-then form. This will actually be sometimes when you're distilling an argument, when you're trying to figure out what people's arguments are, sometimes you'll have to reword it a bit because they might not, even though they use an if-then statement or something similar, they might not, you know, explicitly say if-then, right? So here's some examples of statements that you should probably read as if-then, even though they don't explicitly say it. You know, just keep these in mind. Keep in mind that, like, not every conditional will be explicitly written in this if-then form. Anyone who thinks he's, you know, anyone who thinks everyone is out to get him and he's smarter than everyone else is a jerk. You know, what this is saying is if you think everyone's out to get you and you're smarter than everyone else, you're a jerk. You know, it's another way of saying it, right? Students who work hard in the class will pass. What this means, if you work hard, you will pass, right? Finally, going back to our Schwarzenegger one, only natural citizens can become president of the US. Well, what this means is if you're not a natural-born citizen, you can't become president of the US, right? So just keep this in mind. Sometimes conditionals won't be explicitly written in this if-then form, but the statement really means if, you know, then. Okay, so we'll talk about modus tollens in a second, the other valid form of argument using a conditional. And modus tollens will actually be really important, so I want you guys to, you know, pay pretty close attention to this. But before we do that, I want to talk about two fallacious forms of argument with a conditional. These are really important because people make this mistake all the time. The conditional, as I said, is something people do mess up. So the first fallacious form of argument with the conditional is called affirming the consequent. Again, you guys don't need to know the name of this. Not going to be on a test. You know, it's not terribly impressive at parties that you know the name of this, but you do need to be able to recognize the argument as fallacious, as invalid, if you see an argument of this form. If a student works hard in the class, he or she will pass. Seth passed, so Seth must have worked hard in the class. Well, think about it, right? Remember what we mean by validity. Validity means if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. Now think about this. If it's true that if you work hard, you will pass, does it mean that anyone who passes must have necessarily worked hard, right? Well, no, right? The first statement never says only people who work hard will pass. It says the people who work hard will pass, right? It's perfectly consistent with what this first statement says, that people who don't work hard might pass as well, right? If you're super brilliant, or if you've already taken a lot of stuff on the subject already and know it pretty well, you might be able to pass even if you're really lazy, even if you don't put a lot of work in, right? So for everything the premises say, the conclusion might be false, right? Or I'll give you guys another example, right? If it snows a foot, then TCC won't have in-person classes, right? Hampton Roads region, we don't even need a foot. A couple, an inch will do it. But if it snows a foot, we won't have in-person classes. Well, that's a true conditional. If someone says, well, if it snows a foot, we won't have classes. Then they say, well, we're not having classes, so it must have snowed a foot, right? That doesn't work, right? Because there are plenty of reasons we might cancel classes besides getting a foot of snow. It might be Labor Day. It might be that we're having a hurricane. We might, as in the case that we're currently going through, there might be an outbreak of this new virus, right? So, if it snows, we won't have class, but from the fact we don't have class, you don't know that it snowed because there are other things that might cancel class, right? In this statement, we know if people work hard, they will pass, but we don't know from the fact they passed that they worked hard because there might be other ways to pass the class, right? All right, so hopefully you guys see why affirming the consequent is a fallacious argument. Sort of the twin of affirming the consequent is denying the antecedent. These arguments make the same sort of mistake. So if you think you're smarter than everyone else and that everyone is out to get you, then you are a jerk. John does not think he's smarter than everyone else, that other people are out to get him, so he's not a jerk, right? Well, again, if you do think everyone is out to get you and that they're idiots, then you're a jerk, right? But there might be other ways of being a jerk, right? If you are horribly sexist, that is, at the very least, you're probably a jerk, right? If you are incredibly rude to other people for no good reason, probably also a jerk, right? So, if you are these things, if you do think you're smarter than everyone else and they're out to get you, then you are a jerk. Simply because you don't think them doesn't mean you're not, though. There are other ways to be a jerk, right? So this is not a valid argument. All right. Hopefully that's clear to you guys why these two are invalid forms of argument. You can imagine ways that the premises are true and the conclusion false. But let's end with the other valid form of argument using the conditional, modus tollens. I actually, when I first heard these lectures, I had a mistake here. It actually said modus ponies for one of these, which is, I don't know. I thought it was funny. I don't know. The worst name for a rock band ever, right? Anyway, modus tollens is an argument of this form. If you work hard in class, you will pass. Jimmy did not pass, so Jimmy did not work hard. If A, then B, not B, so not A, right? If it's really true that anyone who works hard will pass the class, then we know from the fact that somebody didn't pass that he didn't work hard, right? If A, then B, so you know that whenever you have A, you're going to have B as well. Well, the fact you don't have B tells you you don't have A, right? Modus tollens is a valid form of argument and an important one. Another example of modus tollens. If you follow the Atkins diet, you will lose weight. I haven't ever done it myself. I'm told this is true. I'm also told that it's kind of miserable to follow the Atkins diet, but whatever. I had a friend who did it who said he's never craved a vegetable, a carrot in this case, so strongly in his life. But he did lose like 30 pounds. So anyway, if you follow the Atkins diet, you will lose weight. Dan has not lost weight, so Dan has not followed the Atkins diet, right? If it's really true that everybody who follows this diet loses weight, you know from the fact that somebody didn't lose weight that they didn't follow the diet, right? So modus ponens and modus tollens, if A, modus ponens, A, so B, is a valid form of argument. Modus tollens, if A, then B, not B, so not A, also a valid form of argument. And both of these will be really important in this class, right? Conditionals are going to be important because when we look at moral theories, we're going to ask ourselves, what are the consequences if this theory is true? You know, what does this theory tell us about certain cases if true? You know, that conditional will be examples of modus ponens, but, you know, sometimes the theories will tell us things that are surprising. You know, the theories might commit us to claims that we might not want to accept. That might be a reason to reject the moral theory. That will be an argument that uses modus tollens. So this will be important. I'll talk a lot more about it. If this isn't immediately clear to you, don't worry. You know, we'll do a lot more practice to apply it. But hopefully you guys, just a first pass at this, you know, the basic idea will seem clear to you.